A long weekend ahead for Novak Djokovic in legal limbo in Melbourne. The world number one stuck in detention amid arguments over whether or not he should play in the Australian Open. Now even his mum is wading in.
I feel terrible since yesterday, last 24 hours, that they are keeping him as a prisoner. It's just not fair, it's not human.
And as Djokovic waits for Monday's court hearing, we take a look inside the quarantine hotel where he's being held. Also tonight, an apology from the PM, but new phone messages raise more questions over the Downing Street refurbishment. An inquiry is launched after ITV News investigation into allegations of racism in social housing. And...
Cassie! Yes, hey, darling.
Cassie's come home, a touching family reunion 8 years after their spaniel was stolen.
This is the ITV Evening News with Mary Nightingale.
Good evening. World tennis number one Novak Djokovic is stuck in a Melbourne quarantine hotel tonight after his visa for the Australian Open was rejected at border control. The Serbian had been granted an exemption from the country's strict COVID vaccination requirements, but that caused such an uproar, Australia's Prime Minister had to step in to insist the rules are for everyone. Well, now even Serbia's president has intervened, claiming Djokovic is being treated differently from other players. But whether or not he does eventually get to play, the first court he's going to be seeing is a federal one to appeal against deportation. Here's our sports editor, Steve Scott.
After a near 10-hour stalemate at the border overnight, the world number one was moved to a detention hotel where he'll be holed up until his appeal next week. Outside, protesters urging the government to release Djokovic and the refugees he's now sharing accommodation with instantly. At home in Serbia, his parents accused Australia of mistreating their son.
If you are a mother, you can just imagine how can I feel. I feel terrible since yesterday, last 24 hours, that they are keeping him as a prisoner. It's just not fair, it's not human.
An asylum seeker in the same hotel showed us how Djokovic will be spending Serbia's traditional Christmas Day tomorrow in a cramped room and certainly not enjoying his usual diet.
We've been receiving a moldy bread and the food is kind of disgusting and we don't have access to fresh air.
The saga began the moment Djokovic landed yesterday, believing a medical exemption he'd been granted would give him free passage through immigration. Border guards cancelled his visa.
Rules are rules, and there are no special cases. Entry with a visa requires double vaccination or a medical exemption. I'm advised that such an exemption was not in place, and as a result, he is subject to the same rule as anyone else.
News of Djokovic's exemption enraged many Australians. They recognise with an election round the corner, politics might be at play here. Fellow tennis players have some sympathy, but it is limited.
In some way, I feel sorry for him, but at the same time, he knew the conditions since a lot of months ago. So I went through the COVID. I have been vaccinated twice, and if you do this, you don't have any problem to play here.
For someone who usually enjoys the high life, the next 3 days will be both humiliating and quite the challenge, and there's no guarantee of a happy ending. Steve Scott, ITV News.
Here, the Prime Minister has apologised after being criticised by his own ethics advisor over the funding of controversial renovations to his Downing Street flat. Lord Geit hadn't been made aware of key phone messages between Boris Johnson and the Tory donor who had initially paid for the work. Well, Mr Johnson said he didn't recall the messages, which were released for the first time today. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Newscaster.
It's up there that Prime Ministers live, in a flat for which they get £30,000 of public money to do up. It looked like this in David Cameron's day, and like this under Theresa May. But when Boris Johnson turned up, his taste for wallpaper was somewhat more expensive, with an eye for designer Lulu Little, whose styles can be seen here. The controversy was the revelation that Tory donor Lord Brownlow initially paid for the refurbishment that ended up costing £112,000. In May, an investigation by independent advisor Lord Geidt said Johnson, who by then had picked up the bill, hadn't known about the donation and hadn't broken the ministerial code. But then in December, the Electoral Commission revealed a missing WhatsApp exchange, in which the Prime Minister himself asked Lord Brownlow for more money in November 2020. Today those messages were released by a disappointed Lord Geidt. "I'm afraid parts of our flat are still a bit of a tip," began Boris Johnson. "Get Lulu to call me," replied Lord Brownlow. "I should have said," he added, "as the trust isn't set up yet, approval is a doddle, as it's only me and I know where the money will come from." In a letter released today, the Prime Minister apologised, claiming he'd forgotten the exchange and hadn't been able to search for it because he'd changed phones. But in person, at a vaccination centre, he had less to say.
Do you really expect the public to believe you didn't disclose key messages with Lord Brownlow about the refurbishment of your flat because you had a new phone?
I followed the ministerial guidance at all times, and yes.
Today, Lord Geidt made clear he was deeply frustrated, but said he still didn't think Johnson broke the ministerial code.
This really isn't good enough, and we need the Prime Minister to now be fully transparent around this very, very sorry saga and all the other instances of Conservative sleaze that we've seen over recent months.
So that is the Downing Street wallpaper. Next up for the Prime Minister, a report into Downing Street parties. Anushka Astana, ITV News.
Well, the Prime Minister was less apologetic today in his attitude towards so-called anti-vaxxers. He said it was time to call them out for spreading what he called mumbo-jumbo on social media. Well, many of those being treated in hospital for COVID are unvaccinated. And it came as more NHS trusts in England declared critical incidents over the Omicron outbreak, as our political correspondent Romilly Weeks reports.
At the Royal Derby Hospital, they're trying to cope with 13% of their workforce off sick. The staff describing the extreme pressures of rising numbers of COVID patients on top of existing demands, with fewer staff to care for them.
It's hard, and we've got increasing pressures from the emergency department to admit patients onto ourselves for further investigations. And then we've got patients here that we need to move off to the wards upstairs to continue their care and treatment. So we've got no beds upstairs. We can't move patients up.
So they need 20, but 20...
With 60% of COVID patients in intensive care unvaccinated. Visiting a vaccination centre in Northampton, the Prime Minister said it was time to call out the propaganda of the anti-vaxxers.
What a tragedy that we've got all this pressure on the NHS, all the difficulties that our doctors and nurses are experiencing. And you've got people out there spouting complete nonsense about a vaccination. They are totally wrong.
You've said the NHS is on a war footing, but you've sent them to fight without the staff they need to be able to do that.
Well, that's not true because, first of all, yes, I appreciate that the NHS is under huge pressure. And yes, you're quite right, Romilly, in what you say about the way it's been continuous over the last 18 months. We've had wave after wave of COVID, and our NHS has responded magnificently.
In another indication of the strain on the health service, a report by MPs today warns that the record backlog of almost 6 million people waiting for treatment in England is likely to get worse. Of those, 300,000 have been waiting more than a year. They include 19-month-old Aisling. She has kidney reflux and has suffered sepsis. She spent more than half her life waiting for an operation.
It's very upsetting that it does feel everything's had to stop for COVID, and I do feel like we need to get back to a way of being able to live again and, prioritise the people that really need the treatment.
At Royal Derby, staff believe things will get even worse over the next few weeks. The Prime Minister has gambled on keeping the country open, but there's been a price to pay. Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
Well, Romilly, the Prime Minister then directly attacking anti-vaxxers, but we understand he's unlikely to do much to restrict their freedoms to encourage take-up then.
There is no doubt, Mary, that the numbers of unvaccinated people in hospital are causing the NHS very great difficulty, and the Prime Minister was particularly animated today in his criticism of those spreading anti-vaccination material online, calling it mumbo-jumbo and complete nonsense. Does this mean that we're going to go for an approach like Italy, say, which is making vaccination mandatory for the over 50s? Well, no. The government thinks it's doing better with its approach of cajoling and encouraging people to get vaccinated while trying to take a stand against the small but vocal minority online spreading anti-vaccination propaganda.
OK, Romilly Weeks, Westminster, thank you. Now, a rare case of bird flu has been discovered in a person in Hampshire, according to public health officials. The UK Health Security Agency said it is extremely rare for avian influenza to pass from birds to humans, but they warn people not to touch sick or dead birds. The infected individual, we're told, is currently well and self-isolating. Now, England's housing ombudsman is to investigate racism in social housing following an ITV News investigation into the appalling conditions some tenants are forced to live in. The issue of racism was repeatedly raised by those we spoke to, and one council whistleblower told us it was rife within the housing department she worked in. And our political correspondent Daniel Hewitt has been driving this investigation. This is appalling. It's a really serious issue.
It's a really serious issue, and as you said, Mary, it's been raised time and time again, not just by housing tenants, but by staff working in social housing. For over 10 months now, we've been looking into this issue, the issue of social housing and the state of it, people living in, frankly, unlivable, barely believable housing conditions. And for some, they have raised the concern, the worry that they believe their race, their ethnicity has been a barrier to getting that complaint dealt with properly. Today, the Housing Ombudsman said in response to our investigation, he was appalled by some of the situations we'd uncovered and he wants this looked at straight away. Now, we've spoken to tenants who say that they change their name because they believe they're dealt with quicker if the person on the phone thinks they're white rather than black. We've had one woman tell us a council worker told her to go home. She can always go back to where she came from. Another said he believed the fact his English wasn't his first language was a barrier to getting this solved. We know that this is a problem. The Housing Ombudsman has looked into issues like this before in our investigation and has been pretty damning about the housing associations and councils. So this will be taken very seriously by the sector.
Yeah, amazing. Daniel, thank you very much indeed. Still to come on the ITV Evening News. A year since protesters stormed the US Capitol, President Biden attacks his predecessor. And new efforts to rewild the English countryside. Those stories and more after the break. Join me then. And welcome back. President Joe Biden has accused Donald Trump and his supporters of holding a dagger at the throat of American democracy, 1 year on from the riots at the US Capitol. The president said his predecessor had refused to accept the will of the American people and was creating a web of lies over the election results. Trump responded by accusing Mr. Biden of destroying the nation. Our correspondent Robert Moore was the only TV journalist to film with the insurrectionists as they stormed inside the Capitol building. He reports on the legacy of those shocking events that day.
A year after these scenes, and the question still reverberating across America USA! USA! Is whether such chaos and carnage will be replicated in the next election cycle. The president himself came to the Capitol today, down the same road used by many of the insurrectionists. And he issued the starkest possible warning.
I did not seek this fight brought to this Capitol 1 year ago today. But I will not shrink from it either. I will stand in this breach. I will defend this nation. And I will allow no one to place a dagger at the throat of democracy.
He recalled his predecessor's words of a year ago.
We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
And Biden said in words never spoken by one president of another that Donald Trump was a liar and a loser.
Former President of the United States of America has created and spread a web of lies about the 2020 election. He's done so because he values power over principle. He's not just a former president. He's a defeated former president.
12 months ago at 2:13 p.m., we had followed the rioters as they fought and crashed their way into the inner sanctum. When the mob crossed this threshold exactly a year ago, it wasn't just a window and a door that was broken, but something much more precious, that sense that violence has no place in American politics. Some of those invaders that day, like Josh Pruitt, continue to insist theirs was an act not of treason, but of patriotism.
I don't think any of these people are remorseful at all. I think most of us believe exactly what I've said, and just that we think that we were doing the right thing.
Tonight, Congress paused. To reflect on a day that served as a warning that American democracy is more fragile than anyone imagined. Robert Moore, ITV News, Washington.
Here, the Conservative peer Baroness Mone is being investigated by police for allegedly sending a racist message to a man of Indian heritage. Lady Mone is accused of sending the message to Richard Linton-Jones during a disagreement after a fatal yacht collision in 2019. She denies the allegations. The Leader of the Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has defended the jury system after the so-called Colston Four were controversially cleared of criminal damage for removing a statue of the slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. Mr Rees-Mogg called juries great sublime protector of liberties. And a man has lost a 7-year legal battle against a Belfast bakery that refused to make a cake with the message "Support gay marriage." The European Court of Human Rights ruled the bakery, run by evangelical Christians, did not discriminate against Gareth Lee because he is gay. Now, farmers in England are to be given grants to rewild their land to provide habitats for wildlife, to conserve species and to restore rivers and streams. If successful, the government's large-scale nature recovery scheme could one day cover an area the size of Lancashire, as Neil Connery explains.
It looks like a timeless landscape, but 20 years ago this was intensively farmed land. Now, around 80% of Knepp Castle Estate in West Sussex has been left to rewild in a pioneering project. The lessons learned here could help shape the future of farming and the countryside.
We've got so much of this willow now in this landscape, this ex-arable land, that the purple emperor butterfly, this extraordinary, our second biggest butterfly, it's a big purple job, this big, it's like a sort of tropical thing, has come back in huge numbers.
Charlie Burrell, who owns the 3,500-acre estate, believes the government's plans to encourage schemes like this are an opportunity to be seized.
We've had a generation of being told to just produce more and more cheap food. That's what we've been doing. We need to that thought of actually thinking about landscape change and landscape. How do we fit the more space of nature within a landscape?
Farmers and landowners in England could be paid with government subsidies to turn areas into nature reserves or to restore floodplains. But groups representing landowners and rural businesses say the plans must be realistic.
Farmers need to be profitable before they can be concerned about the environment, but the two can go hand in hand, and that's where sustainable farming comes into its own.
The government wants to see more large-scale rewilding projects like this one, but the success of what's been announced today will ultimately depend on getting the balance right between food production on the one hand and protecting nature on the other. Farming creates 10% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, and it's hoped more rewilding will help in efforts to tackle climate change. Neil Connery, ITV News, West Sussex.
And finally tonight, the touching tale of a dog reunited with her owners after 8 long years apart. Cassie, the Cocker Spaniel, was stolen in Surrey when she was still a puppy, and she was eventually traced to Sussex thanks to the help of a veterinary nurse and pet detectives. And, as Chloe Keedy reports, to the delight of her owners.
Cassie! Hey, darling.
It's 8 years since Stuart and Jane last saw their dog Cassie.
My wife was only saying a few months ago, she says, I think Cassie's dead now.
But Cassie is very much alive.
She's a good girl.
Stolen from the couple's back garden as a puppy, they'd given up hope of ever seeing her again, until a phone call came out of the blue.
She said, we're a vet in Chichester. Did you have a chocolate cocker? I said, we did 8 years ago, but she got stolen. She said, she's come into the vets and we scanned her and we found out that she's your dog. I said, that's right. Good girl.
But getting her home wasn't that simple, and it took the help of a specialist pet detective to track her down.
Well, the veterinary nurse had to give Cassie back to the person that brought the dog to the practice. And when she contacted us, it was a case of us looking at who we knew that were breeding illegally in that area, and we were very, very quick to identify the couple that had Cassie.
And when they found her, Cassie had 3 puppies, which have also now been rehomed.
It was just wonderful to get Cassie back after 8 years. When you tell people about it, they say, 8 years? I'll say, yeah, I'm afraid it was 8 years.
An unexpected Christmas present, and one, this time, he hopes, is for life. Chloe Keedy, ITV News.
And that's it. Tom's here with news at 10, but for me and all the team, bye-bye.